Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. When Charles Darwin returned from his voyage around the world, he had no grand declarations, only notebooks, and thousands of observations that would change science forever. This video tells the story of the man who explained how life works, and who himself went through the long path from a confused student to the author of the most controversial theory of the 19th century. You will learn why he kept his theory secret for 20 years, who Alfred Wallace was and why he almost overtook Darwin, what natural selection means and how evolution actually works, and why, after the origin of species, the world was never the same again. This is not just a story about science. It is a story of fear, doubt, scandal, and of one discovery that changed everything. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. Charles Darwin was born on February 12, 1809 in the town of Shrewsbury in western England, in a house filled with books, habits of order, and the quiet comfort of respected wealth. His family belonged to that circle of people about whom one said, an old name, good money, serious education. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a man of enormous curiosity, a doctor, poet, philosopher, and author of books about plants, animals, human nature, and even about evolution. He wrote about the development of species long before his grandson would begin to form his own theory. Erasmus was a dreamer inclined toward grand ideas, while Charles's father, Robert Darwin, was his opposite, a pragmatic doctor, tall, stout, silent, commanding respect, and always achieving his goals. In that house, Charles felt himself the youngest, not only in age, but in importance. His elder sisters were dutiful, his mother died when he was only 8, and his father seemed a man from another perfectly ordered world. He watched his son with affection, but also disappointment. In one family conversation, he said, "You care for nothing but shooting dogs and catching rats. You will be a disgrace to yourself and your family." Those words wounded Charles deeply. He remembered them for the rest of his life. Yet his interest in nature appeared early. He collected shells and insects, watched birds, and filled his notebooks with quiet observations. He was not brilliant in class, but he could spend hours watching earthworms burrow through the soil. Such curiosity was not seen as serious, neither at school nor at home. When he entered Edinburgh University, where his father sent him to study medicine, everything went wrong. Charles could not bear the sight of blood. He fainted at his first anatomy lesson. He tried to listen to the lectures, but found the academic dryness unbearable. Soon he began skipping classes, spending his time instead in the museum, studying collections of animals and minerals. At Edinburgh, he met one of the few people who truly influenced him in youth, a former slave, John Edmonstone, who taught him the art of taxidermy. Edmonstone showed him how to preserve birds, how to handle delicate details with patience and precision. But more important were the stories he told about South America, the jungles, the distant lands, the life beyond the safe English order. Those stories fired Darwin's imagination far more than any lecture. Realizing that medicine was not his path, his father transferred him to Cambridge, expecting him to become a clergyman. For the Darwins, this was a respectable career for a younger son, stable, moral, and dignified. Charles did not object, not out of faith, but out of a desire to avoid conflict. In Cambridge, though he attended theology lectures, he was drawn to something else. There he met the professor of botany, John Henslow, known as the man who knows everything. Henslow taught him the value of observation, the method of collection, and the discipline of scientific precision. Darwin was not a top student, but he was dedicated. He collected beetles, classified plants, and read natural history. He began to wonder, why are species so different? Why do some animals have organs that seem unnecessary? Why do certain species live only in certain regions, even when the climate is similar elsewhere? Cambridge became his laboratory of thought. He did not reject religion, but doubt began to grow, quiet, without rebellion. Reading the works of theologian William Paley, who claimed that nature was the perfect creation of God, Darwin increasingly noticed facts that did not fit that perfection. Vestigial organs, fossils of extinct creatures, the strange distribution of species. It was not yet a theory, only scattered thoughts. But Darwin's mind was already in motion, absorbing, comparing, questioning, and searching. Cambridge prepared him for the next step, a journey that would forever change both him and the science of life. In 1831, when Darwin was 21, he still had no clear idea of what he wanted to do. He had graduated from Cambridge, earned a bachelor's degree, and, according to his father's plan, was to take holy orders and live as a quiet country clergyman. But his passion for botany, entomology, and geology would not leave him. Then came a letter from Henslow, an unexpected offer. The Royal Navy was preparing an expedition on the ship HMS Beagle to chart the coasts of South America. The captain needed a gentleman companion, educated, observant, and interested in natural history. It was an opportunity few could dream of, and one that would change everything. Darwin agreed almost immediately. His father objected. The voyage seemed dangerous and useless. But after persuasion and the intervention of their relative Josiah Wedgwood, permission was granted. The Beagle was a 10-gun brig about 30 meters long, with a crew of 74, and one very young naturalist who had no idea what awaited him. The ship sailed from Plymouth on December 27, 1831. Darwin was seasick for weeks, confined to his cabin. The captain, Robert Fitzroy, stern and deeply religious, was nearly his age, but far more experienced. Their relationship was respectful but tense. Darwin quickly realized that the captain viewed the world through the lens of divine order, while he himself was beginning to question it. In Brazil, Darwin found himself surrounded by lush forests, immense trees alive with color, movement, and sound. He described it as a symphony of light and scent. But amid the beauty, he saw horror, slavery. He watched with disgust how black servants were treated and refused invitations from slave owners. It was his first clear moral stand, the first time he consciously opposed accepted belief out of inner conviction. The Beagle then moved south to Patagonia, where Darwin spent months on land. He rode across the pampas, hunted with local gauchos, and discovered the fossils of a giant extinct creature, the Megatherium, a prehistoric sloth the size of a rhinoceros. Near its bones he found modern armadillos, smaller but similar in form. Could old species turn into new ones? If so, how? In Chile, he witnessed a massive earthquake on February 20th, 1835. Houses collapsed, the ground split open, and later in the Andes, he found seashells high above sea level. How had they reached such heights? Slowly, he began to see Earth as a living, changing planet, shaped not by sudden miracles, but by continuous, natural processes. He was inspired by the ideas of geologist Charles Lyell, who argued that the same forces shaping the Earth today, erosion, sedimentation, uplift, had always been at work. In Tierra del Fuego, Darwin met the native Yagan people. Fitzroy had once taken several of them to England to civilize them, teach them English and Christianity, then brought them back home. Within weeks, they abandoned European clothes and manners, returning to their old ways. For Darwin, this was a revelation. Environment shapes man more than education does. His faith in the idea of civilizing progress began to crumble. Then came the Galapagos Islands, a volcanic, desolate archipelago unlike anything else on Earth. Each island hosted different creatures. Darwin collected dozens of species of finches, noting their varied beaks, thick and strong on one island, thin and sharp on another. He did not yet realize the importance of this, but later it would become the seed of natural selection. Later, near Australia, he studied coral reefs and proposed his own theory of their formation, that they grew around slowly sinking islands, creating ring-shaped atolls. It was one of his first original scientific models and gave him confidence. He could not only observe, but also explain. During the voyage, he sent crates of specimens back to England: insects, plants, fossils, minerals. When the Beagle finally returned in 1836, Darwin was no longer an amateur traveler, but a respected naturalist. He was not yet famous, but the scientific world was watching him. He did not yet have the answers, only a sense that species changed, that nature itself evolved. The next 20 years would be spent uncovering how. When the Beagle returned, Darwin was only 27. He came ashore not with a finished theory, but with hundreds of notebooks and thousands of samples: bones, shells, stuffed animals, sketches. He sensed that behind the details lay a pattern, a law of nature. He avoided London's noise and immersed himself in quiet work. Scientists began analyzing his collections. The ornithologist John Gould identified the Galapagos finches not as mere varieties, but as distinct species, each adapted to its island. The same was true of the shells, corals, and fossils. Darwin was astonished. He had thought he'd collected minor variation, but they were connected forms, shaped by environment. He did not rush to publish. His health, weakened during the voyage, became fragile: stomach pains, dizziness, fatigue. Whether it was physical illness or inner tension, no one knows. He moved to Down House, south of London, with his cousin and wife Emma Wedgwood, and created there a quiet laboratory of life. He lived by a strict routine, morning walks along his sand path, then hours in his study, observing earthworms, plants, and bees. He kept notes on every detail: how seedlings grew, how flowers turned toward light, how insects behaved. Each experiment, however simple, was part of a greater question: how does life change over time? He began a private notebook, Notebook B, on the transmutation of species. In it, he wrote plainly that species might change, that new forms might arise from old ones, that extinction and adaptation were not accidents but the rule. Yet he stayed silent. He knew what he was approaching, an idea that challenged the very foundation of creation. The church taught that God had made all things fixed and final. Darwin's theory said the opposite. There are no eternal forms, only processes, selection, and change. But he lacked one thing: a mechanism. He knew nothing yet of genes or mutations, or how traits were inherited. Gregor Mendel was already working on that, but his studies were unpublished. Darwin worked in the dark, needing thousands more observations to build his theory on fact, not conjecture. He published other works first, on coral reefs, geology, and his Voyage of the Beagle. These built his reputation and prepared readers for what would come. He corresponded tirelessly with pigeon breeders, farmers, botanists, zoologists, asking about variation and inheritance. He gathered evidence that nature, like humans, could select traits, but not consciously, rather through countless generations of survival. The principle was already forming. The individuals best adapted to their environment survive and pass on their traits. Years passed. He knew he was walking a razor's edge. He feared not criticism, but error. He wanted his idea to be unshakable. And then, in 1858, nearly 20 years after the Beagle voyage, a letter arrived from Alfred Russel Wallace, outlining a theory almost identical to his own. Darwin realized the time for silence was over. By the time Darwin fully shaped his view of nature, behind him lay not only a 5-year voyage around the world, but also almost 2 decades of thinking, observing, experimenting, corresponding, and analyzing countless facts gathered from many corners of the globe. Throughout those years, he tried to understand life in its deep, underlying structure, not merely to describe what the eye can see, but to explain why species differ from one another, why they appear and disappear, and by what principle nature seems to choose whom to keep and whom not. Darwin began with the most obvious, with what anyone can witness by watching living creatures. No offspring is ever absolutely identical. Some animals have a slightly longer beak, others a paler coloring, others stronger legs or broader paws. These differences, which might seem trivial, are in fact the foundation of biological variability, and they are, in Darwin's view, the raw material from which nature shapes new forms of life. He concluded that in every generation there is natural variability that is not imposed from outside and not directed by a mind, but arises spontaneously and constantly as an inner property of life itself. Yet differences alone do not explain why some forms persist, while others vanish. Here the second key principle enters: heredity. Although Darwin knew nothing of genes and could not use terms that would only appear after Gregor Mendel, he clearly saw that certain traits are passed from parents to offspring and become fixed within a lineage. Farmers and breeders use this knowledge in practice, producing new varieties of plants and breeds of animals, and Darwin carefully studied their methods, reasoning that if humans can guide selection in a chosen direction, then nature itself must possess a similar mechanism, only without intention, without goal, without design. The third pillar of his theory was the struggle for existence, which he understood not as constant combat, but as a web of pressures: shortages of food, competition for space, the danger of predators, changes in climate, disease, the absence of partners for reproduction. He emphasized that in every generation, far more young are born than can survive in real conditions, and in this environment of excess and limitation, selection is inevitable. Those survive whose traits give even a small but genuine advantage. And finally, the crucial point: natural selection. This was the principle that tied everything together. Unlike artificial selection, where people consciously choose which traits to preserve, in nature selection is unconscious, slow, and continuous. Nature selects, not because it wants to achieve something, but because certain traits simply give their bearers more chances to survive, reproduce, and pass those traits on. Thus, over time, beneficial features accumulate, useless ones fade, and a species gradually changes. Darwin carefully avoided terms that would ascribe purpose or will to nature. He did not say that animals develop to become better. He stressed, everything happens strictly within the limits of the environment. In a hot climate, those who better tolerate heat are favored. In arid conditions, those who conserve water more effectively. Where predators are dangerous, those who are faster, quieter, or less conspicuous. It was in this context that he later used the phrase survival of the fittest, though he was not its author. The philosopher Herbert Spencer coined it first, and Darwin only later included it in later editions of On the Origin of Species, clarifying that the fittest does not mean the strongest or the smartest, but simply those whose traits match the demands of their environment. This distinction is vital. Nature does not reward the best. It preserves those who fit. To explain his idea, Darwin offered dozens of concrete examples. He spoke of pigeons bred in England, noting how readily breeders derive new varieties from a single ancestor. He described the finches of the Galapagos Islands, where each island produced a different beak type, long and slender for catching insects, short and stout for cracking seeds. He wrote about mollusks, whose shell shapes can vary with depth or soil composition. He studied pollination in plants, showing how some are adapted to bees, others to wind, others to ants. All of these observations illustrated one thing. Life is plastic. It changes, and it changes lawfully. Darwin did not claim that humans descended from monkeys. That was a crude simplification spread by critics. He spoke of a common ancestor of humans and other primates in the distant past. He merely extended the same logic he applied to mollusks and finches to the entire animal world, including humankind. For him, this did not destroy human dignity. On the contrary, it deepened our understanding of our place in nature. He wrote, "The grandeur of life does not lie in its having been created once and for all, but in its unfolding by simple laws, beginning with the simplest forms and gradually becoming more complex, yielding the variety and beauty we observe today." Such was the theory of evolution, without shouting, ideology, or slogans. Only observation, logic, and patience. By the end of the 1850s, Darwin had long known that his ideas not only contradicted prevailing religious views, but also challenged scientific tradition itself. He kept working in the quiet of Down House, continuing to gather facts and experiment, still postponing publication. His manuscripts grew, he drew schemes and diagrams and searched for ever new lines of evidence, while keeping his theory largely secret. Only a few trusted colleagues knew what he was truly working on, and even fewer grasped the scope of his plan. Darwin hoped for enough time to perfect his work. He planned a large, multi-volume book with illustrations and a full presentation of the facts. He called it his Book of a Lifetime, and he might have polished it for years more, had one letter not arrived. In June of 1858, while Darwin was working in the garden, a letter with an exotic postmark was delivered to his home. The sender was Alfred Russel Wallace, a naturalist then in distant Malaysia. Wallace was much younger than Darwin, came from a poor family, lacked a university education, and had spent most of his life on expeditions. He earned his living by collecting rare plants and animals for private collections. But he possessed a sharp mind, a passion for observation, and an instinct for nature's regularities. Like Darwin, he studied the geographic distribution of species, compared forms, and sought explanations for their differences. Enclosed in the letter was a short manuscript. Reading it, Darwin felt shock and dread at once. The text contained a compressed statement of the very idea he had been nurturing for nearly 20 years. Almost point for point, step by step, Wallace described the mechanism of natural selection, the struggle for existence, heritable variation, and the gradual transformation of species under environmental pressures. It was brilliantly written, and most troubling of all, it was right. Darwin was crushed. He wrote to his friend, the botanist Joseph Hooker, in despair. "Everything has collapsed. Wallace has anticipated me." He did not accuse. On the contrary, he admired Wallace's clarity and independence of thought. But he knew that if he remained silent now, all he had worked on since the late 1830s would be overshadowed. Not because of theft, Wallace had acted honestly and did not know that these ideas had long been forming in England, but because science often remembers not those who thought first, but those who spoke first. That summer of 1858 brought a decision that remains a model of academic ethics. Rather than compete or suppress someone's work, Darwin, Hooker, and another ally, the geologist Charles Lyell, proposed a joint presentation of Darwin's and Wallace's ideas at a meeting of the Linnean Society in London. They prepared a text stating the main principles of the theory, supplemented it with excerpts from Darwin's letters dated well before Wallace's letter, and added Wallace's own manuscript. The meeting, held on the 1st of July, 1858, passed almost unnoticed by the general public. There were no ovations, no scandal. Everything happened quietly. But from that moment, the idea of natural selection was in the world. Darwin no longer had any excuse to remain silent. He understood he could not wait. In the autumn, he threw himself into work. Instead of a massive encyclopedia, he decided to prepare a shorter, persuasive book that would set out his views clearly and accessibly. He wrote quickly, with hardly a pause, painstakingly selecting examples, cutting long explanations, discarding secondary details. Everything he had observed, analyzed, and felt over 2 decades had to fit into one volume. 13 months after receiving Wallace's letter in November of 1859, a volume with a yellow cover appeared in London bookshops on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. The first printing numbered only 1,250 copies, and it sold out on the first day. When the first edition of On the Origin of Species was published in November of 1859, Darwin, contrary to the usual image of a scientific revolutionary, did not seek publicity, give lectures, or issue bold statements to newspapers. He left London, keeping his distance from the storm he sensed would soon break in both scientific circles and the broader public. Even so, the effect was immediate. Written in clear prose, free of unnecessary jargon, rich with examples and vivid observations, the book made a powerful impression not only on naturalists, but on many far from science. The scientific world split. Some, especially younger zoologists, geologists, and botanists, greeted Darwin's theory as a breath of fresh air. It explained dozens of scattered facts and brought order to what had seemed chaos. Others, particularly those whose careers rested on the fixity of species, met it with hostility. But the main arena of conflict was not the academy, it was the pulpit. What Darwin had cautiously described as a natural, lawful process many perceived as a direct attack on religion. Darwin nowhere in the book spoke plainly about humans. He deliberately avoided the topic, saving it for later so as not to pour oil on the fire. But the implication was obvious. If all living species arose from common ancestors, then humans were no exception. The conclusion did not need to be stated. It was already in the air. Theologians were outraged. Their anger was directed not only at a scientific theory, but at the very thought that man is not the crown of creation, but part of nature, subject to the same laws as an ant, a bird, or a fish. This seemed blasphemous. Newspapers published biting caricatures. Darwin with simian features, perched in trees, sporting a tail. One image stuck in the public mind, a bearded ape with Darwin's face seated thoughtfully on a skull. That picture would linger in culture for a long time. Afflicted by chronic illness and panic attacks, Darwin avoided open debate. He did not even attend the famous public encounter between Bishop Samuel Wilberforce of Oxford and the biologist Thomas Huxley, held in June of 1860. There, in an Oxford hall, religion and science met face to face in a dramatic scene later turned to legend. The bishop asked Huxley with sarcasm whether it was through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed descent from an ape. Huxley, unflustered, replied that he would rather be descended from an ape than from a man who uses great gifts to obscure the truth. The phrase entered history, and Huxley became what people would later call him, Darwin's bulldog. Darwin was grateful. He wrote to Huxley that he could not have borne such pressure, yet he continued to insist that his aim was not to fight but to explain. He was a gentle, kindly, very cautious man. Even within his family he felt tension. His wife Emma was deeply religious, and her husband's theory caused her inner pain. Darwin respected her feelings. He did not try to convert her. He simply said, "I do not deny God. I'm only trying to understand how the world is arranged." Society reacted in many ways. Some admired the scale and courage of the thought, others were offended and angered. Many read the book only partially, leapt to conclusions, and treated it as a manifesto of atheism, though Darwin never once stated unbelief. He tended rather to step aside, admitting that the origin of life itself remained a mystery to him, and that nature, even when explained, is no less wondrous. Meanwhile, the book went through new printings and translations. In each new edition, Darwin revised, refining phrases, adding examples, avoiding harsh claims. He disliked bluntness. He did not seek conflict. He kept working, caring less for polemic and more for facts. But one question hung in the air. If all life is subject to natural selection, if species change, vanish, and arise, then what is the history of humankind? Darwin knew that sooner or later he would have to answer. When the storm surrounding on the origin of species began to subside, Darwin, despite exhaustion and chronic illness, did not retreat into obscurity. He continued to work calmly, systematically, without pomp or self-promotion. Life at Down House flowed in a measured rhythm: morning walks, hours in the study, correspondence with colleagues, and daily observations of plants and animals in his own garden. In his letters, he remained polite, inquisitive, and modest, openly admitting what he did not know and avoiding hasty conclusions, even when his correspondents wrote with sarcasm or hostility. He never saw himself as a prophet, only as an observer. Eventually, he decided to return to the subject he had deliberately left out of his first book. In 1871, he published The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, where he spoke openly about humanity's place in natural law. He wrote that humans did not descend from modern apes, but shared with them a common ancestor. He analyzed human anatomy, instincts, facial expressions, and behavioral traits, comparing them with those of other species. At the same time, he emphasized that along with physical traits, humans had developed moral feelings, empathy, compassion, and a sense of ethics, which were also products of selection, not the struggle for survival, but a more intricate process of sexual selection and life within society. Soon after, he published another book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. In it, he compared gestures, facial movements, and tones of voice, showing how much of what we call human has biological roots. He was interested not in abstract ideas, but in concrete details: how eyebrows move in fear, how the voice changes with irritation, how a dog bares its teeth or a man frowns. For Darwin, these connections between species revealed the shared thread of life. He wrote not as a moralist, but as a biologist, yet beneath his words there was reverence for the complexity of existence. Darwin's health worsened. He suffered from stomach pain, weakness, and insomnia. He suspected that his illness had been caused by a parasite contracted during the voyage of the Beagle, though modern doctors believe it was more likely psychosomatic, the result of years of inner strain. He avoided large gatherings, seldom left Down, and rarely appeared at scientific meetings. Yet to his final days, he remained in correspondence, welcomed visitors, and discussed new discoveries. He rejoiced sincerely in the success of others, encouraged young scientists, shared notes freely, and never claimed absolute truth. He died on April 19, 1882, at the age of 73, in his bed, surrounded by his family. By then, his reputation was beyond question. Although debates about his ideas continued, the scientific world acknowledged his contribution. The British scientific community proposed that he be buried in Westminster Abbey, and the family agreed. Thus Darwin came to rest beside Newton, among those whom England deemed worthy of eternal remembrance. After his death, Darwin's works did not fade. They became a foundation. Even during his lifetime, scholars had begun developing neo-Darwinism, an effort to unite natural selection with the genetic laws discovered by Mendel. In the 20th century, biology, ecology, psychology, and medicine were built upon evolutionary logic. His name became a symbol of scientific courage, discipline, curiosity, and moral restraint. He was not called a prophet, but he was recognized as the founder of a way of thinking in which nature is not a system of miracles, but a system of causes. Darwin never claimed to know everything. He asked questions, offered careful answers, and patiently listened to criticism. He changed not only how we understand animals and plants, he changed how humanity understands itself. The life of Charles Darwin was not a story of struggle or dramatic gestures. It unfolded quietly, almost unnoticed from the outside, yet within it took place a slow and profound labor: observation, doubt, reflection, and the gradual approach to understanding how the world works. He did not seek to change science, to leave a mark in history, or to call himself a discoverer. He simply asked questions, precise, honest, and consistent, and searched for answers in the beaks of birds, in the movements of worms, in the shapes of leaves, and in the span of wings. He looked at nature as a living, changing system with no frozen forms or eternal boundaries, only endless movement, slow, almost invisible, but continuous. He saw how one trait could strengthen while another disappeared, how chance became law, and how diversity left the trace of evolution. He wrote not for debate or glory, but because he believed that if one looks closely at the world, patiently and without prejudice, one can find in it a kind of order, not absolute, but alive. Darwin did not see himself as a prophet, did not seek approval, did not crave conflict. He merely gathered evidence and arranged it into a coherent, almost musical system. And perhaps it is precisely this, not the loud declarations, but the respect for facts, for details, for the slow rhythm of nature, that forms his greatest legacy. Today, his theory has become the foundation of all biological science, but more important is how he changed our very attitude toward life. He showed that greatness can arise from the small, that evolution requires no divine intervention, and that rational explanation does not diminish wonder, it deepens it. Charles Darwin departed peacefully as he had lived, yet he left us more than books, ideas, or a scientific framework. He left us a way of seeing, one that does not fear difficult questions and does not rush to answers because it knows. In nature, nothing happens all at once, but everything, in time, comes to be.